Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Food for Thought seminar. I'm Paul Nunn. I'm part of the Food for Thought team. Before I introduce you to today's speakers, I'd like to remind you of some housekeeping information. As this is a Microsoft webinar event, you can't unmute yourself or come on camera, and the chat function is disabled. We do, however, welcome any questions or comments you may have, and you can post these into the Q&A box, which should appear at the right of your screen. Please do note that any questions will be picked up at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to ask questions using the Q&A box as we go along, and we can come to them at the end. Today's seminar is being recorded, and the seminar recording will be uploaded to our Food for Thought YouTube channel shortly and circulated in due course. For today's seminar, I'd like to provide a warm welcome to our speakers for today, Ellie Ball and Debbie Hawker. Ellie Ball is a senior policy researcher at Trussell, having previously worked in research roles in mental health and suicide prevention within the NHS and Samaritans. Her research interests centre around the intersection of economic inequality, mental health and suicide prevention, with a focus on participatory approaches. Debbie Hawker is the audience insight analyst at Trussell, where she explores how the UK public and key audiences perceive food banks, hunger and the charity's mission. She has previously worked at health charities and across bespoke research projects at the third sector agency, NFP Research. With that, I'll hand over to our wonderful speakers to discuss their recent research on why are a significant proportion of people going without essentials like food, not accessing charitable food aid. And from all of us at the Food for Thought team, we hope you enjoy the presentation today.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you so much for having us. We're really excited to have the opportunity to share this research with you. This is part of a wider project that we've done over the last 2 years, looking at people's experiences of hunger and hardship in the UK. But today we're specifically focusing on one strand within that research, where we look at people who are food insecure or going without the essentials, but not accessing support through charitable food provision. So just so you know what to expect, we'll do a little bit of background, we'll explore a bit about which groups fall into this category, and then we'll look really specifically at why people aren't accessing charitable food provision, looking at barriers to accessing support, trade-offs they've got going on, and different reasons. And one of the reasons why we're really interested in this is that we have a lot of data about people that do use our food banks, as Trussell is a food bank network. But really what this piece of research tried to look at a much bigger variety of people who are experiencing hunger and hardship in the UK. We know that food bank use is just the tip of the iceberg compared to people who are not accessing services like ours. And just a little bit of a content warning for today. It is a bit heavy by the nature of what we're talking about. We will be talking about and sharing quotes from people that can't afford the essentials, that have been going without food. So just a bit of a content warning that it can be quite heavy. So just to give you a little bit of like overarching context of what we're looking at. So we've got about 4.5 million households, which is about 14.1 million people who are food insecure in the UK in 2024. But of these, about 2.7 million households, so that's about 6 in 10 food insecure households, have not used any form of charitable food provision. So this is a really big number. It's a really large proportion of the UK and people that aren't accessing support. And just so that we're really clear up front, I'll do a couple definitions so that we know exactly what we're talking about. So when we talk about food insecurity, we've used the Household Food Security Survey module, which is a bit of a mouthful, but really what we've done is just looking at, are people able to afford food? Are they cutting down the size of their meals? Are they eating less? Are they not eating even though they're hungry? Have they lost weight or not eaten for a whole day because they haven't been able to afford or access food? And for this research, we've also combined that with people who are going without the essentials. And we talk about that internally as people who are considered destitute, which is a bit of a kind of Dickensian word, but really what we mean by that is people who haven't used or haven't been able to access 2 or more of what are considered the 6 essentials over the past month. And those essentials are shelter, food, heating, lighting, clothing and footwear, and basic toiletries. And so what we've done is we've combined people who can't afford any or aren't be able to access the essentials and people who are food insecure, and we'll just refer to them throughout the presentation as people going without the essentials because otherwise it's a massive mouthful. And then on the other side, we're talking about charitable food provision, which is also a bit jargony. But so that you understand, this is and does include food banks. So people that you might stereotypically think of, people like Trussell and the network of food banks that we work with. But we're talking about food provision in its broadest sense. So it could also mean that people haven't accessed soup kitchens for hot or cold food, and also means that people haven't accessed low cost services like social supermarkets or food pantries, something that we've seen a big growth of in the last few years. So we're talking about people not accessing a huge variety and like the real breadth of additional food provision that's out there. So that's a little bit on definitions and the context to get us started. And luckily for you, no research project is complete without a methodology. So we'll just give you a really quick overview of what we did and how the research happened. So we did this research and carried it out with Ipsos throughout the middle of last year. And it was split into two parts. We did some quantitative research. So that was an online survey of about 4,500 people in the general public. And of that group, kind of 683 were people who fit into this category of going without the essentials, but also not accessing food support. And then we also did some qualitative research. So we interviewed 35 adults who fit into that group, and we made sure that we got a real demographic mix. So across age, gender, disability, sexuality, employment status, caring responsibilities, whether they were accessing social security. So we got a real range of opinions and views in those interviews. So that's a little on the methodology. And what's going to happen, I'm going to crack on with a bit about the quantitative data overall, and then Ellie's going to take us through some of the more detail about the reasons people aren't accessing charitable food provision. So firstly, on this chart, we probably see what we'd expect. So we'll just talk it through. We've got food security level along the bottom there. So we've got high on the left, so people that don't have any problems accessing food, and then very low food security on the right, where people are really struggling to be able to access and afford food. And the percentage we've got up the side there is the proportion of that group amongst the general public who have accessed charitable food provision. And so we'd see really what we'd expect. If you've got high food security, you're very unlikely to have accessed charitable food. And if you've got very low food security, then you're more likely to, which is as we would expect. But what's interesting is the huge proportion of people that are missing from those top two bars. So there's a really large number of people, as we saw in the first stat that I showed on the second slide, that are not accessing any kind of charitable food provision, even though they have low or very low food security. So that's the context that we're looking at. But within that, there's obviously lots of groups that have that are more likely to fall into this category. And I'm sorry, there's a few kind of double negatives here, so I'll try to be really clear. So what we're looking at here are people who are within these demographic groups and are going without the essentials, but are less likely to have accessed charitable food. So people aged 55 and over, 83% of people aged 55 and over who have not used charitable food provision, even though they're going without the essentials, compared to only half of people in the same situation who are aged 18 to 34. Similarly, people who are not in the LGBTQIA community and people from white ethnicities or people without a disability are all less likely than their counterparts to have accessed charitable food provision, even though that section of that group is going without the essentials. And this is something that we'll start to kind of hypothesize and think about. Is it that these groups have better access to coping mechanisms or other support? Maybe they have lower inescapable costs or face different or less intersecting challenges. And especially this group of people without children or people who do not have a caring responsibility, which Ellie will talk about in more detail, they are less likely to access charitable food provision. And this is something that we see people are making trade-offs and living in difficult and complicated situations. And if they wouldn't push that upon a child or put that upon someone that they have a caring responsibility for, they would reach out for support and access charitable food provision, or more likely to if they have children or someone they're caring for, but they are willing to go through that themselves and don't see that as a massive issue for them to have to, or don't see it as a big enough issue to reach out for support if it's only them that's struggling. So that's some of the different demographic differences that we see. So just to give a real top line on the reasons why people are not accessing charitable food provision before Ellie gives you more of the detail. So you can see from this chart, in the dark green bars, these are reasons that people selected that they hadn't used charitable food provision. And in the mid-green bars, these are that they didn't select that reason. And we asked this question in two different ways so that we didn't let anything fall through the gaps. So firstly, we asked people in an open-ended way, just with a text box, what are the reasons that you haven't? And then we also offered afterwards a tick box selection where we offered some areas, so we made sure there weren't some bits that weren't missed. And the main thing that you can see here is that 76%, that chunky big green bar at the top, that 76%, so about 3/4 of this group didn't access charitable food provision because of their own perceptions of their financial hardship, whether that relates to their feeling that they weren't in big enough financial problems, that they didn't have a level of need compared to other people in their communities, and that it moves into what's normal. Do they understand what is an acceptable way for people to live and have to survive when they can't afford the essentials? Then below that, we've got practical barriers and accessibility. So about 1/4 of people in this circumstances said that was an issue for them engaging with charitable food provision. Then we've got a fifth who talked about shame, stigma, and embarrassment, something that we talk about a lot at Trussell, but that we see across the media and in journalism about how people are presented and perceived, and the fear of being judged if you need to access support services. Then at 14%, we have people getting by using different methods, so talking about trade-offs or getting cheaper or different food for various different reasons. And then we've got 7% who talked a lot about like the practicalities of accessing that food in like what is delivered, would it meet dietary requirements and things like that. So that's a real quick overview to give you the framing for what Ellie's going to give you some more detail on now.
Thank you so much, Debbie. Really nice to be here with you all today. So yeah, I'm now going to talk you through each of the reasons why people who are going without essentials had not accessed any charitable food provision in a little bit more depth. This is very much just a top line summary of the findings. We only have a short amount of time today, but we will be sharing the report with you that we published last week at the end of the webinar that you can look into, which has the full detail. So firstly, as Debbie said, the largest reason, 76% of people who are kind of going without essentials told us that they hadn't accessed charitable food provision because of perceptions of their own financial hardship. So this is made up of people saying that they're either not facing financial hardship, they did not think that they needed it, or that they felt like other people needed it more. This was reiterated in our interviews, where it was really clear that many people that we spoke to, despite going without food or going without other essentials, do not consider themselves to be facing financial hardship, and therefore just think their situation doesn't warrant accessing charitable food provision. Linked to this, there was a really strong moral sense of not wanting to access food support in case this took support and resources away from people that may be worse off than them and maybe facing more severe hardship. And we really saw that kind of sentiment of, oh, other people have it worse, my situation isn't so bad, come through kind of again and again from people facing all kinds of different situations. So we found this quite interesting, and we wanted to unpick this a little bit and actually look at some of the data that we had relating to this group of people's financial situations to actually see what's kind of going on here. So we did find that there were some indicators that as a whole, this group has slightly better access to some financial buffers and some protective factors when you compare them to people that had accessed charitable food provision. So they were more likely to have savings, they had less debt on average, and they had a slightly higher average income. However, the percentages weren't enormous, and this is only going to be true for kind of a fraction of this group of people. We also found that they were less likely to be disabled, have children in the household, or have caring responsibilities, again, compared to people that had accessed charitable food provision. So it seems like maybe the income that they do have is more likely to be able to stretch a bit further. And overall, when you can kind of combine these things, it seems like these factors are maybe protecting people from some of the worst impacts of hardship. and that will make it less likely for them to perceive themselves as being in need of charitable food provision. Despite this, it's really important to balance this with the fact that there is very stark evidence that these people who think that they're not facing financial hardship and therefore think that they're not kind of in enough need to access charitable food provision are frequently facing very unacceptable experiences. So as a minimum, as Debbie kind of said, everyone we spoke to as part of this research was either experiencing food insecurity and/or were going without at least two essentials like shelter, clothing, toiletries. And that was like the kind of bare minimum. Many people that we spoke to were actually facing much deeper levels of hardship than this. So when we look at the more kind of severe end of the spectrum, 1 in 4 people who are saying that they haven't accessed food support because they're not facing financial hardship are going without 3 or more essential items. And over 1 in 5 of people, again, who say that they're not facing financial hardship are experiencing very low food insecurity, which is the most severe form of food insecurity. By that measure, it means that they'll be regularly skipping meals, regularly going hungry, potentially going like multiple days without eating. So it's really clear that the scale of people who are going without food and essentials, often very regularly, who don't consider themselves to be facing financial hardship, is a really worrying sign that unacceptable experiences and unacceptable forms of hardship are becoming quite normalized in the UK. And we've seen this through this research, but it's also supported by wider evidence that we've looked at that shows that living on a low income and the challenges that come with that, like skipping meals and feeling hungry, are becoming kind of normalized. So this quote says, "I still feel I'm far better off than a lot of people. I would feel very uncomfortable taking food away from someone. I don't eat very much. I can survive on what I have, even though it's not very much." So this quote really speaks to that experience of feeling that others are worse off than them and not wanting to take support away from other people despite experiencing food insecurity. And I think it kind of like touches on that normalization of hardship as well. Like I don't eat very much, I don't need very much. Situations that from another perspective, we kind of feel like that's not really okay. But for them, it's kind of becoming quite normal. So moving on to practical barriers and accessibility. Over a quarter of people had not accessed charitable food provision due to issues around practicalities and accessibility of the food support. So this included just not knowing how to access it or not knowing where it was, not thinking that they would be eligible, issues around transport, barriers relating to health, and then dietary and cultural restrictions as well. In interviews, we found that awareness of charitable food provision and how to access it was actually really varied. So some people discussed not seeking support due to limited practical knowledge of how to access the kind of charitable food provision, not knowing what the process involved. And quite a few people had assumptions around there being eligibility criteria, meaning that they would kind of be excluded from services. And some people also had kind of concerns around the referral process and not understanding how that worked, being worried that they might have to kind of prove that they were struggling in some way, and that being really off-putting to people. However, to balance this out, there were some people that said, even though I don't know how to access it, I feel confident I would be able to figure it out. I would get in touch with the council. I could find that information if I needed to. Some specific practical barriers prevented some people from accessing the charitable food provision. So that included just getting to the food bank, the cost of transport, the food bank's opening hours, just not working with their schedule and like carrying heavy bags. But again, on balance, several people acknowledged that they would be able to find ways around that if they needed to. Perhaps not surprisingly, disabled people that were going without essentials are more likely to say that they hadn't accessed charitable food provision because of practical barriers or issues with accessibility compared to similar people that were not disabled. And in our interviews, people described additional challenges of kind of their physical disability or health condition, including meaning that they weren't able to travel or not able to travel very easily or independently, not able to kind of physically carry the heavy bags of food. And then also mental health conditions made it difficult for people to access charitable food provisions. It made it hard for people to leave the house. It meant people kind of needed a certain level of motivation to actually access the support. And if people were facing kind of mood disorders and things like that, that's actually really hard. And then also conditions such as anxiety were linked to kind of fears of stigma and judgment and just presented like additional barriers to reaching out and going and getting that support. This quote says, "It's only 3 miles up the road, but it's almost £7. That's a lot of money just for one journey." So this speaks to a huge barrier that many people will face. If people are struggling to afford essential items and they are not going to be able to afford £7 to get to the kind of food bank or wherever it is. So this really demonstrates that unless extra support is offered, often charitable food provision will be excluding a lot of people, especially those living in kind of rural communities and areas that don't have great transport links. Moving on to shame, stigma, and embarrassment. So 1 in 5 people had not access to charitable food provision due to shame, stigma, and embarrassment, and that included feeling embarrassed or being afraid of feeling judged and stigmatized. So we saw a real sense of shame and feelings of failure associated with needing to access charitable food provision. That came through really strongly in this research, but we see it time and time again, both with our own research, with people accessing trustful food banks, but also it's very well evidenced in the kind of wider charitable food provision evidence base. In this research, particularly, we saw with people with children, there was a huge concern around people being seen as unable to provide for their family. And then we also saw higher levels of shame, stigma, and embarrassment in households where no one is working, and also amongst people that are receiving social security income. So this is likely due to the kind of harmful stigma and stereotypes that these groups of people are already subject to all the time. And it's really concerning to think that this is then compounding to push people further away from the support that they need. Other people were afraid of being judged or stigmatized by others for using charitable food provision, which was really prominent in close-knit communities or areas where the food provision is offered in quite a visible way. So like food banks being hosted in someone's church, for example. And some people were also afraid of being judged through the referral process itself and kind of having to explain their situation and feeling like potentially the support service itself could almost be judgmental. However, again, several people said that there's no shame in accessing support. And although some people felt like it would be maybe, it would hurt their pride to access it, they would still do that if they needed to, especially parents. If they needed to provide for their children, they said, of course, I would just put my pride aside and go and do it if I needed it. I think that's something that came through very strongly. It's always that if I needed it, which kind of touches on the first point again around perceptions of people's perceptions of their own hardship, and they don't think that they do need it. We found that shame and stigma compounds with mental health and then also with social isolation. So people with mental health conditions were more likely to say that they hadn't accessed charitable food provision due to shame, stigma, and embarrassment, and then a similar pattern amongst people that were socially isolated. This could highlight the protective effects of social support and community in reducing feelings of shame and stigma, which we'll touch on a little bit more later. This quote says, "It's more of a pride thing. If I needed something, I would put myself in debt." So this really speaks to the lengths that people will go to actually avoid accessing charitable food provision due to their pride. And we've really seen this throughout the research that people see charitable food provision as a real last resort. And I think that's the case that we've seen in other pieces of research that we've done as well. So this leads into the kind of other means and methods that people are utilizing to get by when going without essentials to avoid accessing kind of that support. So 1 in 7 people had not accessed charitable food provision as they were getting by using different means and methods. And when we say different means and methods, this includes cutting down on meals and other essential items, but also kind of looking for reduced price food, using food waste apps, and then receiving support from family and friends. There's quite a spectrum of things in there, but I'll unpick that a little bit. So people were regularly cutting back on both food and other essentials to get by on their limited resources. So people described skipping meals or eating smaller portions, eating less nutritious food, so just kind of living on pasta and rice and things like that. buying reduced price food, and then what we've described as extreme budgeting. So that's people going to, like multiple shops in one day, or going to shops at 10 p.m. at night and things like that, and doing things that take quite a kind of mental and physical toll to try and find savings where they can. In terms of other essentials, people were doing things like reducing their heating or electricity, or just not turning it on at all, not paying their bills, relying on credit, and then building up debt, avoiding socializing and leisure activities, hobbies, just things that make life enjoyable, cutting out travel by car or public transport, not replacing clothes or essential toiletries like sanitary products. And then in one case, someone told us that they actually stopped taking their medication to try and kind of save money. So whilst doing these things meant people kind of felt like they were getting by, people also kind of unprompted described a range of different negative impacts that they're experiencing as a result of cutting back on these things. So that included, as I mentioned, the kind of mental load of the budgeting and shopping around and trying to just balance everything. People mentioned losing weight due to not eating enough, reduced concentration and then making mistakes at work, mental health impacts, including low self-esteem related to maybe not being able to replace their clothes and things like that. And then strains on relationships and feeling isolated due to kind of the avoiding socializing. This quote says, what we would have for dinner is maybe some toast, maybe a cup of coffee, and then we would just go to bed early. So this is quite a sobering quote, which really speaks to the lengths that people are going to get by. It really shows how people are living in survival mode, like kind of going to bed early just to try and get through that hunger and lack of energy, as opposed to kind of accessing the charitable food provision. Informal support from friends, family, and communities were a real lifeline for many people that we spoke to. A lot of people mentioned that they were relying on this to help them afford the essentials. And some people said that this directly removed the need for them to access charitable food provision. So it's kind of things like, oh, my mum does my food shopping for me, so I don't need to kind of access a food bank or anything like that. So people described a range of different support that they were getting from people around them, which included financial support, so gifts or loans of money, but also food. So people were paying for each other's shopping, providing meals, providing other essential items such as school uniform and toiletries. And then in some cases, people were also getting kind of childcare, like from their parents, to facilitate them to be able to go to work. So whilst this was kind of really beneficial for a lot of people, it did come with kind of challenges. A lot of people described and acknowledged that the support that they were receiving was kind of unsustainable. So people that were relying on parents that were maybe aging, or their financial situations were going to change with things like retirement. And then other people reflected that they really felt like leaning on their friends and family made them feel like a burden, and it was putting a strain on their relationships. And then several people just didn't have access to either any friends or family at all, or friends and family that were in a position to be able to help them. So whilst it was bringing a lot of positives to people, it's definitely not sustainable. And we do see the impact of this in the Trussell community. So we've seen in other research that it's often at the point that this informal support is exhausted, that people need to turn to charitable food aid as a last resort. We found in our wider Hunger in the UK project that half of people referred to food banks had already relied on a loan from friends and family. So whilst this informal support is really valuable, we can see it's not sustainably protecting people who are going without essentials, and it's leaving people at risk of kind of worsening hardship in the future if anything changes there. Access to any formal support to afford essentials was actually quite limited. So we had some examples of people accessing financial support and advice. So things like people were using like a household support fund and different kind of monetary support, and then also kind of debt advice, financial advice, and things like that. But this wasn't common, and we weren't seeing any kind of like coherent themes coming out around what was helpful there. It was more just little pockets of like odd bits and bobs. So this quote says, if we didn't have my mum, we probably would have needed support years ago. And it really speaks to that impact of informal support directly removing the need for people to access charitable food provision. In many cases, people expressed a preference to receive support in this way. And it kind of links back to not wanting to take support and resources away from maybe people that don't have that family and friend support as well. So people said, oh, why would I access a food bank? I can get support from my mum. I'll leave the food banks to people that maybe don't have that. And then the last reason, and by far the smallest, 7% of people had not accessed charitable food provision due to perceptions of the delivery of that food provision. So that included not wanting to engage with religious aspects of the service, not trusting the quality or safety of food, or the food provision being in a place where they didn't feel comfortable. This came up much less in the interviews as well, but some people did hold perceptions that charitable food provision would only offer kind of limited options or no choice, and that the food provided would be of poor quality or low nutritional value. And some people just said, I'd rather kind of not eat or just eat a very small amount than kind of eat what they would provide to me. So there was like quite a lot of assumptions in there as well. And some people expressed concerns that the food wouldn't cater to their dietary requirements or allergies, and therefore not wanting to kind of access it. There were kind of mixed findings around food provision being offered in religious spaces. So many food banks in the Trussell community are offered in partnership with churches or are run by churches. So we explored this a little bit. It didn't come up much in the interviews, but we did find through the survey that people who aren't religious were more likely to have not accessed charitable food provision due to perceptions of how it's delivered compared to people that are Christian. So it seems like there is something going on there, but again, it didn't come through in the interview, so we weren't able to unpick that too much. So this quote says, I don't know if a lot of the food available would be suitable for me because how silly would I be walking into a food bank and being like, everything needs to be gluten-free. So it really speaks to that experience of just assuming that the food bank wouldn't cater to their dietary requirements. They wouldn't be able to eat the food and actually feeling very uncomfortable with going and asking for that when it's already kind of perceived as like a free kind of gift, I suppose, and just kind of preferring to go without rather than having to navigate that. So I will hand it back over to Debbie now to kind of talk through what this all means.
And thank you so much, Ellie. So just a few kind of quick conclusions from us, really, of what we feel that the research is saying to us as Trussell as an organisation, but also for wider positioning. So the first point really is that food banks and other forms of charitable food provision, even things like community larders and social supermarkets, which are on the rise, don't seem to be reaching the majority of people that can't afford the essentials, that they're leaving a huge gap of lots of people that either don't consider themselves appropriate for these kinds of support, and that there are, as Ellie has run through, lots of other accessibility and other barriers to people being able to gain that support. At Trussell, even though we are a network of food banks, we also think we need to look at the source of the problem rather than a sticking plaster, and not necessarily that food banks are that solution, but instead that people's income is a better way to solve these problems and solve the root issues. The second issue and thing that we're focused on was that people feel that they need to get by on their own, and that this normalization of hardship, kind of severe hardship of skipping meals, not having their heating on, cutting themselves from off their social networks that Ellie's gone through, that it's really clear that the provision that we might provide at Trussell is just the tip of the iceberg, and actually there's a real problem of severe hardship in the UK, and that it's actually a bit scary that that's becoming increasingly normalised, and that people think that that's a normal thing to happen both for them and in their communities, and only seeing themselves as people that don't require that support because other people have it worse off. And then our third point was really about the way that people are accessing food banks and other provision is actually when they've already really exhausted their other forms of support, whether that's using all of their personal savings, when they've already relied heavily on informal support and networks and family and friends to get to the point where they turn to charitable food provision. And lots of people are hanging in that position just before needing it or just before turning to it, and that for the people that are in that space, they're often in an unsustainable place, where the solution of food provision is not one that's going to be sustainable and protect them from hunger and hardship in the future. So it's normally nice to finish a presentation on a positive high, but sadly this research doesn't really give us that opportunity. But we hope that you can see more. We've definitely learned a lot from doing it, but hopefully that you have also seen a way that we can understand the extent of hunger and hardship in the UK even better, and that this lays some understanding that we can move forwards from of the people that we're not currently reaching through the food support that's out there. So thank you for having us. I think that we're going to have a bit of time for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Ellie and Debbie, for a fantastic presentation. We can now take any questions. So if anyone has any questions for our speakers, please continue to use the Q&A box. And I think we've got a few questions that have come through now. One is around definitions. We have one from Sophia saying, sorry if I missed this at the start, I was late joining. What is considered essentials in this research in terms of, being able to buy the essentials?
Yeah, of course. So we've used the definition of essentials. That means when we see someone going without the essentials, that means that someone has gone without at least 2 of food, heating, lighting, clothing and footwear, or basic toiletries. So when we talk about not having the essentials, people have gone without at least 2 of those things. And that's how we've described that.
Okay. Actually, we have another question from Sophie. In the FSA's Consumer Insights Tracker, we see people reporting money-saving behaviours that may impact food safety. For example, eating food past its use-by date or eating leftovers that have been left around for a while. Did you capture anything in the research, e.g. behaviours, that may affect food safety?
I'm happy to take this one. No, we didn't specifically ask about this or ask any questions or probe on it in the interviews. I think it's really, really interesting. And I would be shocked if people weren't doing those kinds of things. I think, again, maybe it's just something that's become so normal that people don't even think to bring that to the discussion when we're kind of interviewing them. I think it'd be something really interesting to explore in future research as well. So we can kind of take that away. We're currently thinking about a 3rd wave of hunger in the UK. So that's a great thing that we might be able to explore in that. Thank you for the question.
Okay. We have a question here from Jeannie Ray. What do you think is needed to ensure those that need help know where to find and receive it, even if they don't think they do?
Do you want me to start, Ellie, and then you can carry on? Sure. I think there's a couple different factors. One thing that we haven't talked about in this presentation, but something that we did in the interviews, was we offered people a story of someone basically in a very similar situation to themselves, and we would tell them the story about this person and say, do you think this person needs food bank support? And they almost always said yes. So the recognition of people in similar situations needing support, I think there's something about storytelling and how we're communicating with people about who is eligible and who is able to access support. I think in a wider variety of ways that people talked about accessing information, lots of people in the interviews brought up, how could we advertise is an awkward word in the food bank world, but how do we be clear about what services are offered through kind of more official channels? So how would people know to get that information about what services they could get through the council, or when they engage with other kind of more official and formal support partners and providers? But lots of the questions that people had was around the referral process, and we do use a referral process at Trussell, and that's partially to make sure that we are being clear about who is receiving food, but also to make sure that other support services are involved in the support of that person. And we can talk more about referral processes in a new one. But I think there was and is some, even though we don't necessarily want this research to point to like we need to fix specificities in the food bank process, actually that we can do more clarity about what the referral process looks like and give people information about that. So if they're considering getting support, they would feel comfortable going through that process and have that information up front about how to access that support. I'm sure I've missed things. Ellie, do you want to add some more?
No, that's great. Yeah, in the full report that we can share, we do have a kind of list of recommendations that participants suggested that would make it easier for them to access support if they did need it. It's not something that we've really focused on in this research because we're not trying to kind of necessarily give food banks advice on how they can expand their reach. We're trying to balance this with actually we believe that we want to end food banks in the UK. And kind of just expanding food banks is if we had all the resource in the world, maybe that would be great, but actually targeting our resources at that kind of ending the need for food banks in the first instance, we're just trying to kind of balance that. So there are some kind of recommendations in the report that we've kind of fed into the Trussell kind of internal community, if it links into any work that food banks are already doing and if they'll find that useful. But yeah, we're just very much trying to balance that with kind of not encouraging food banks to increase their reach too much and trying to balance that with wider kind of thinking around how do we strategically kind of end hunger and hardship in the UK and end the need for food banks. But yeah, there are some really interesting things in there around the things that people would find helpful for access.
Okay. We have a question here from Azuka. My church runs a food bank. Is there a way to help people with allergies when they do food collection to include these people? Most times donations of food and not other essentials people need.
You want me to start off again, Ellie, and you can add? Yeah, fantastic question. That's very exciting. There are, just to say, especially off the back of Ellie's point, that lots of food banks do offer loads of different food and kind of access for things that are either around allergies or halal food, especially specific to the communities that they tend to be serving and what's needed there. So it's people's fear that they don't offer that, but lots of them do. And one of the things that we've seen, we do kind of a winter collection in supermarkets, and quite often food banks will produce like little lists of what they really need in their food bank, and quite often there will be things like gluten-free or lactose-free items on that list, very specific, to ask the public or members to donate those specific items when needed. So there are little ways, and maybe in your church there's ways that people can add. I've seen it in different kind of collection points where there's a little label saying these are particular things we need this week. So when people drop off an item, they can see, we're really missing this dietary requirement or something, and people can provide that the next week if they're willing and very generously donating. So that tends to be how they get food. But also we see that lots of our food banks have to buy a lot of their food, especially specific items. So sometimes if food banks don't have enough of specific dietary requirement food for specific dietary requirements, they will buy that food in so that they can ensure parcels are fit for the people that they need to give them to. If that doesn't cover it, Ellie, add anything?
Yeah, no, I think it's amazing. And I think it just kind of touches on that awareness point. So like Trussell food banks generally do offer some choice and flexibility if you have dietary requirements or allergies, but I think a lot of people would just hold that assumption that they wouldn't, and that puts people off getting through the door. So I guess it's just about, if you're advertising your kind of charitable food provision, making that really clear so people are aware that that's like an option.
Annabelle says, a great presentation and really interesting research. Thank you. I was wondering if you had any insights on what we can do to address how people perceive their hardship to help them make better use of charitable food aid, or is that the next stage of research?
You start, Ellie. You go for it.
I mean, yeah, it's amazing. It's an amazing question. I think it's one that Trussell as a whole are grappling with at the moment, and we've just kind of started our new strategy for the next 5 years, I think it is. We've got a whole program around prioritising hunger and hardship as part of our new strategy. So there'll really be that includes kind of cross-disciplinary working with like comms experts, marketing, social media, research, policy, and they'll really be grappling with some of these questions around how do we kind of change perceptions of hardship, both for people that are kind of supporting it, but also removing some of that stigma and changing some of that awareness. I think Truss will always say that kind of the social security system is just incredibly inadequate, and until we kind of have an essentials guarantee where everybody's actually getting enough money through social security to be able to afford the essentials, but also kind of work is paying enough and things like that, people will kind of continue to experience this hardship, and it will just kind of continue to be normalized. I don't know if Debbie had anything to add.
I think it is a really interesting question and something that we would love to work and do more on. I think there is trying to get my words together. I think the normalization of hunger and hardship is a really interesting part of this. And I think, as I said earlier, the idea of sharing stories where people immediately are like, that's unjust, people shouldn't have to live like that, they should get support, but allowing people the space and the time to recognize that in their own lives and understand their own hardship is really difficult. So I think, as Ellie mentioned, we're hoping to do more research in the coming year, and I think it's a space we'd be interested to explore, like how do we not only recognize that, but how do we also help take people on that journey to understand their own situation and the situation of people around them as well, especially in communities where poverty is kind of really entrenched. But very good question, and we've probably only got like a half keen answer for you there. Sorry.
I would say as well, I think there's something around stigma, because particularly with the external research that we looked at, there was a real like cognitive distancing of people being like, oh, those people are in poverty, and almost holding kind of negative stereotypes and stigmas of those people, even though they themselves were also like sharing that experience. So I think a lot of people have kind of internalized stigma as well, which maybe makes it really uncomfortable for them to reflect on their own experiences. So I think just generally trying to reduce stigma and stereotypes around living on low income and things like that would hopefully help with some of that normalization of hardship stuff as well.
Okay. Cara asks, have you found any insights on whether those under 18 access food support?
I can start. So the research that we carried out was only with over 18s, but the research that we've done overall for hunger in the UK talks about people in their households. So it talks about data of not only the person who's filled out and kind of taken part in the research, but also everyone who's living under their roof and that they're feeding and doing that process for. So yes is the answer, but that'll be in some of our wider research, which Ellie, actually, you've been closer to if you want to say any more, but we can also share that as well.
Okay. Ian Clark says some of the people who rely on other sources, non-food bank use of support, for example, family and friends, are still facing very low food security. So without that other support, they would be facing even greater need. Would you agree? It suggests some people will not use food banks under any circumstances.
Yes, I think that's definitely something that we've seen through this research. I think the key thing that we've taken away is that food banks and charitable food provision just aren't going to be for everyone. And the reason why we're not kind of pushing, food banks to overcome some of these barriers as much as maybe you might initially think, is because you can make the perfect service and some people still won't use it. And actually what needs to change is people not being in a position where they have income that's so low that they're going without essentials in the first place. So yeah, I think for some people there's just such a barrier, and there's so many different factors that come into it that we didn't even necessarily explore in this research, like cultural factors and things like that, like geographic factors, kind of like people's cognition and ability to kind of use the internet and research things. There's just so much that comes into it that means that charitable food provision it's never going to meet everyone's needs that are food insecure or going without the essentials. And I think, yeah, what this research shows is actually we need to tackle that problem at the source, whilst we're still kind of providing our food bank service and charitable food provision, which is really important. And yeah, it's really important to actually end the need for food banks entirely.
Okay. One last question here from Joseph. A bus ticket costs 10 cans of baked beans. Do you have any plans for the future to help people in need with free transportation, such as a sponsorship from local transport companies?
I can give this a shot. This is a bit more in our kind of operational team. I think the answer mainly to that is likely no. We're always looking for partnerships with different organisations that we can work with, and some food banks, especially in rural areas, do offer delivery services for people that wouldn't be able to get to the food bank, but that tends to be more from an accessibility angle. We're really aware that the access to physical food banks is a real impracticality, but working across the whole of the UK and 1,200 distribution centres makes it really difficult to kind of create an overall way that we can support people with transport. But individual food banks also work in their local communities and may offer different services. So there are some individual food banks that do offer additional support around things like transport and helping people get bus passes and things like that. But I can't say that that's offered cohesively across the whole of our food bank network, just because of the geographical variation and how the organisations vary. But our operations team would know more if there's anything else on that.
Okay. Right, so that's the end of the Q&A session. We have Adam has very kindly put up the links to the Trussell homepage and the link to the report of this research. I'd like to say thank you to Ellie and Debbie for their fantastic presentation. I'd also like to let everyone know that the seminar recording will be available via our YouTube channel, which will be posted in the Q&A. This also includes recordings from previous seminars if you'd like to watch any of these. Before we go, I also want to flag that if you're not already on the Food for Thought mailing list and you would like to join the mailing list, you can do so via the sign up link, again, which will be posted in the Q&A. If you'd like to get in touch, please email us at foodforthought@food.gov.uk, or if you are at the FSA, you can search for our page on the intranet. We welcome any ideas for future speakers, and if you're at the FSA and would like to get involved in volunteering for the Food for Thought team, please also get in touch. Finally, if you have any feedback on the Food for Thought series, when we would welcome you to complete our feedback questionnaire, which we'll also share the link to. Thank you all for joining us and have a nice rest of your day. There's a QR code there that will take you straight to the form. Thank you very much and have a good day.